Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for the last day of June, June 30th, 2023. We're in a very fast-moving strategic situation in which there are two completely irreconcilable directions moving aggressively. On the one hand, you have the permanent war faction of the transatlantic, which is committed to continuing the war in defense of the Unipolar Order. And on the other side, you have the emergence of an alternative system of the global majority. And many of you ask questions about the direction of this fight and what you can do. And so I'm going to combine in my first two questions a number of your inquiries and try to give you an answer which will help in thinking about how to act at this incredible moment of crisis. So let's start with the first question, which is people asking, what do you mean when you talk about the unipolar order or the rules-based order? Now, essentially what we're talking about is the most recent evolution of a global empire. And this is the post-World War II period that was defined initially by Churchill, by the Yalta Accord, the division between East and West, but also the North and the South, with the North supposedly the advanced sector, the developed sector, and the South, the poor, the colonial, and eventually post-colonial, but the continuation of an attempt to maintain a neo-colonial system. Now, after 1991, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a promotion of the idea from neocons and neoliberals in the West that the Soviet Union collapsed because the Western neoliberal model won. This is the idea of the end of history as presented by Francis Fukuyama, that from now on, all struggle between different systems has ended. There's only one acceptable model for any nation, and it must be adopted by all nations. And that in fact, this model is the very definition of democracy. And that means subservience to the unipolar order. You give up your national sovereignty to be a member of the club. Now, not only is this supposedly the only acceptable order, but it must be adopted or there will be consequences. Now, what are some of these consequences? Well, you have economic warfare, the cutoff of credit and sanctions as two examples of economic warfare. Then you have the commitment of Western governments and non-governmental organizations to fund so-called democratic opposition. That is, if a nation has a sovereign government which insists on its first order of business, taking care of the interests of its people, if you have that, you're considered authoritarian and you come under attack. And this attack includes funds made available to the so-called democratic opposition, to create color revolutions, to carry out coups, as in the Maidan coup in Ukraine, assassination, and war. These are the tools that are used. And the idea now is permanent war to enforce neo-colonial looting. That's what we mean by the unipolar order, or what Blinken stupidly calls the rules-based order. I say stupidly because the rules are made up as you go, and the rules are those which benefit only the small, powerful nations that represent the interests of a less than 1% of the population, the multimillionaire or billionaire class, against the interests of the rest of the people. So that's the unipolar order. Now, the second question is related to that, and again, I got a number of questions of this sort. What is the motion right now toward a new development architecture? You talk about a new strategic architecture, a new development architecture. What's going on now? And I can tell you there are bilateral and multilateral meetings all the time going on with various nations such as the Chinese and the Saudis, Turkey meeting with a number of different countries and so on. But let me focus on a couple of the bigger ones. You have a meeting that just took place of the leading governments of the global majority, what Sergei Lavrov of Russia calls the global majority. to prepare the agenda for the September 9th G20 summit. Now, the G20 is divided between the G7 nations, and they think they represent the interests of everyone. That's the Unipolar Order. But increasingly, there's an emergence of other nations within the G20 that don't go along with the dictates of the G7. And a number of these countries just met. Sergei Lavrov was there for Russia, but they also included ambassadors from Argentina, Brazil, China, Indonesia, Mexico, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, and Turkey. Now, if you look at the numbers of people in these countries, as well as the GDP, they're at the same level or higher than the G7. And this is the shift that's occurring, and as their leaders are beginning to develop a certain amount of self-confidence, they're establishing new institutions for trade, investment, and political cooperation. The G20 summit is September 9th in New Delhi, and it will be under the direction of the Indians. So this should be an opportunity to move this ahead. Before that, you have the BRICS summit, the 22nd to the 24th of August in Johannesburg, South Africa. Now, what's happening with these international institutions and the global South countries, the anti-colonial forces, is they're moving toward convergence with the ideas of the financial reorganization championed by Lyndon LaRouche for 50 years. LaRouche wrote many articles about development projects based on advancing science and technology to increase the productivity and the value of goods from the physical economy. This was LaRouche's contribution, and it's now at the center of these discussions. The idea LaRouche had is you need an increase in cooperation overall, cooperation between sovereign nations that include trade and investment, which emphasize the physical economy, not the service sector, tourism, or debt accumulation. And important for this is mutual benefit, working for the interests of the other. LaRouche initially put forward the idea of Russia, India, and China as three of the powerful nations that exist outside of the so-called unipolar order that later merged to become the BRICS rather. Now, this is based on a move toward a global economy centered around multilateral agreement among sovereign nations. This is not globalization as most people know it, because globalization is defined by the corporate cartels which dominate Western financial and economic policy that are committed to an anti-sovereign unipolar order. Now, I found that a very interesting article in Fortune magazine, June 25th, titled, "How Long Will the Dollar Last as the World's Default Currency?" Now, the author is skeptical about the possibility of a new currency emerging from the BRICS to replace the dollar, but the article itself shows a growing awareness among Western analysts of why there are moves toward de-dollarization. And by de-dollarization, we mean the use of non-dollar currencies in cross-border transactions, trade, investment, and so on. We also are seeing central banks shifting currency reserves from the dollar, which until recently made up more than 90% of currency reserves around the world, but shift to gold, to yuan, to a basket of currencies as a move toward what's called de-dollarization. And now there's the growing use of the BRICS interbank cooperation mechanism to replace the SWIFT system, which previously was used for cross-border payments and investments. SWIFT became a political tool. It was, as some people say, weaponized against Russia with sanctions. And rather than capitulate, the Russians and others started working out alternatives, which include using national currencies in trade. And I think it was very beautifully expressed by the president of Kenya, who recently said to Macron, "Why should we in Kenya have to buy dollars, trade for dollars, to pay for goods that we buy and sell in other countries?" Why not use our own currencies? And this is the attitude that's developing in the global south. So we're seeing moves in that direction. As I said, the BRICS summit is coming up, the G20 summit in September, and there's probably much more to come, which we'll cover, because since we were at the beginnings of this movement and shaping it, no one knows better than the LaRouche organization the direction that this is going. Now, finally, let me take a question which I think expresses the feelings of a lot of people from my friend Angela in Italy. And she writes about her anger and frustration about the lies and censorship in the Italian media, the hypocrisy, the double standards toward Putin, and so on. And then she asks, can we organize a conference bringing leaders together to build an international peace movement, international peace coalition? Well, first, let me just say, what do you expect from the media cartel? It's part of the corporate cartels that are designed to protect the collapsing unipolar order. And the way they do that is they demoralize people. They convince you you're powerless, that there's no other alternative, that this idea of the one model fits all, if you reject that, you're a conspiracy theorist, you're crazy, you're a Putin puppet. That's the whole purpose of the mainstream media. Well, the point is, don't submit. Don't let them control your mind. I just presented a summary of international motion outside of this system. It's taking place day by day with leaders from countries in Asia, from Africa, from South America. If you live in one of the nations dominated by the Unipolar Order, one of the transatlantic countries, the Five Eyes countries, because I hear from many of you from Australia and Canada, New Zealand about your frustration, find other people who share that. There's more people, when we talk about the global majority, even in countries dominated by the corporate cartels, there's a growing sense of frustration and anger against these governments. Look at the situation in France. What started as a protest movement of the murder of a young man by policemen, which probably reflected a certain amount of institutional racism, is becoming an explosive riot. Why? Because young people have a sense there's no future, that they can't get their government to respond. Remember, Macron, in the face of millions of people in the streets protesting his so-called pension reform, nevertheless rammed it through. So this kind of anti-democratic policy in the so-called democracies is building up tremendous anger and resistance. It has to be organized, not just as an anarchistic mob out of rage, but as creative beings coming together to figure out how do we construct a system that's based on the valuable potential of all people, that we're all mortal, but we all have some higher eternal purpose. And that purpose is to cooperate with other human beings to build just and equitable systems that represent the interests of all. So don't allow yourself to either wallow in frustration or strike out in anger. Engage in dialogue with everyone. You can use the media that we produce at the LaRouche Organization and the Schiller Institute to present this alternative and share our videos, get people thinking. Now, we are building an international peace coalition, which is now about to have its fourth meeting, and it's growing. It's bringing in people from all over the world to discuss how we do this. And today I'll have in the description section a link to the press release on the next International Peace Coalition meeting, but also a link to a very interesting discussion yesterday by the British figure, George Galloway, very interesting character, who is involved with what's called No to NATO. And it's a dialogue which includes Anastasia Battle from the Schiller Institute, talking about how we build this international movement. So don't despair, don't cry in your beer, go out and talk to people. If you don't get a response at first, don't be surprised. The power of the media to convince people to be quiet is incredible. I was just talking to an associate last night who said he first encountered LaRouche in the 1990s, thought it was pretty interesting, but then was told by everyone, stay away from LaRouche, he's bad. Lynn once wrote an article that said something like, he's bad, but don't ask me why. The idea is to convince you that you alone think this way and that there's something wrong with you, when in fact, as I've been pointing out, there's a global majority moving out from under this bankrupt system. If we allow it to continue, we'll probably end up with a nuclear war sooner or later, because that's the intention of the people behind it. Rather than lose the system, they're willing to blow up the world. We can't let them do that. We're the majority. Let's organize in that way, and we can win this fight. So thanks for joining me this week. Share this video, share the links below, and let's build a human future. Hello, thanks for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our videos. Support our independence to produce videos like these. Become a member of the LaRouche organization at thelarouche.org/member. By becoming a member for $25 or more, you'll get special access to the EIR Alert Daily Briefing and Weekly Magazine, which is what I read to stay on top of things.